Okay, great. So thank you very much again for joining us, and thank you to Professor Kaufmann for coming along this evening. We really value his time. So Professor Kaufmann, you can probably see over my shoulder, I've got your book on my bookshelf. It's been a fascinating read thus far, although I'm not sure if the light's kind of getting in the way.
Well, I've got product placement up there, so that I think that's the US version, but that's okay. So.
Yes, exactly. So I just kind of wanted you, if you don't mind, could you just summarize the thesis in the book, please?
Well, Whiteshift is really about it means two things. One is essentially the decline of white ethnic majorities in Western countries during this century, and the politics that results from that of polarization and populism. And then secondly, the sort of, if you like, late this century going into the next century, the kind of beiging and blurring of the white majorities through intermarriage into effectively mixed race majorities that I'm arguing will tend to look to that European ancestry and the collective memories as their kind of myth symbol complex. So those are the two meanings, really, the shorter term, our lifetime, and then the next century, different processes.
Okay, fantastic. And I think, there was a New Statesman article published shortly after the book, which said something like political scientist defends white identity or something to that effect. And it seems as though it was a little bit of a typical thing of, it was the New Yorker, my apologies.
New Yorker, yeah, that was, yeah.
Yeah, but essentially the point that you're making in this conversation was that identity is everywhere. And in my opinion, having researched political theory and identity politics, all that sort of thing, essentially you were saying things that a lot of other people were gesturing towards without ever really wanting to say. So like, what was the impetus? Why did you want to kind of break that silence on the topic, so to speak?
Well, I mean, there's a number of reasons. I mean, I'm probably slightly more able to do it because I'm part Latino and part Chinese and part Jewish. So, I mean, maybe it's less, but I mean, I think part of this issue is that, both in terms of explaining the populist upsurge and the polarization, it's very hard to really understand it without understanding that this is partly an issue of white identities becoming more salient as the demographics decline. The identity becomes more salient, and there's a number of studies that have shown, like in parts of counties in the U.S. where whites are a smaller share, there is more white identity there simply because people are more aware of being different. I think and part of the problem is it's been so surrounded by this sort of toxicity, which has been linked to, for example, Jim Crow and white supremacy on the one hand, and Nazism on the other. So, quite understandably, to some degree, there has been this sort of wariness of talking about white identity as anything other than this awful thing. But actually, if you think about human behavior, if you look at surveys, for example, the more, let's say a white American is attached to being Irish or Italian or some other ancestry, the more they're attached to their ancestry, the more they will identify, the more being white will matter to them. Because it's a bit like a sort of outer skin of like a pan-ethnic identity, like being European as well as being British, or, so it's a simply, and we see it amongst other groups. If you strongly identify as a Cuban, you'll be more strongly attached to being Hispanic and so on. So it's really not that scary a thing. It's just some people are more attached to their extended family. That means more to them. Some people, it means nothing to them. That's a choice. It's partly, there is a heritability. So this disposition to identify that way has a heritable component to it as well. But there is nothing inherently more nasty about identifying as white than identifying as Asian or Hispanic or whatever. It's just, what the past, and again, a somewhat selective reading of the past would say about whether this is a dangerous thing to do or that's a dangerous thing to do.
I think personally it's refreshing to hear someone say there's nothing wrong with identifying with a white identity. And something that you said there kind of piqued my interest a bit, because you said the word choice, but how far is it a choice to identify with your skin color?
Well, it is a choice in the sense that it could matter to you or not matter to you. It's like saying I'm attached to my extended family and that matters to me, or I don't even think about it. And some people are attached to these sorts of identities and others aren't. So that's what I mean by a choice. Now, of course, when you're saying choice as in moving between groups, that's more possible for people who are in between. So for example, if we take third generation Americans with Mexican ancestry, about 60% of those people identify as white. And if they are Republican, they're considerably more likely to identify as white. If they're a Democrat, this is the same person, right? Essentially, they're more likely to identify as Latino on the census. So there is they have more of a choice, but clearly somebody who's blonde haired and blue eyed, last name Smith, or who's very dark skinned, and who is African American. I mean, there isn't that choice there in a way. So that's in terms of, but both of those people still have a choice as to how important their racial and ethnic identity is to who they are. Right.
Yeah, I think that I can definitely see that. And on the mixed race topic, on the mixed race topic, in Britain especially, we recently had the Commission on Racial and Ethnic Disparities report by Dr. Tony Sewell, and responding to that, one of our sort of best public speakers on this, Dr. Rakiba San, pointed out that the mixed race population of Britain is its fastest growing subset, but remains underanalyzed and essentially structurally ignored. Like if there is a structural bias, it's almost against mixed race people in just the absence of talking about them. So why do you think that is? And is it the same in America?
Yes, because first of all, they are still quite small. I mean, they're growing and they are the fastest growing and will remain so. But their presence isn't going to be felt until late this century. And I'll just give you a projection I did with a demographer at the London School of Hygiene, who's now moved on to the ONS, but Britain or England and Wales will still only be 7% mixed race, roughly, according to our calculations, by the middle of this century. Still pretty small. By the end of the century, it's 27%. And then by 2150, it's 75%. And then it's pretty quickly 99. So what I'm trying to say is we're still in a very early stage. It's perhaps somewhat understandable that this emerging group hasn't yet made an impact in demographic numbers, and therefore it's not being talked about. Also, of course, it doesn't fit the established categories we have, and doesn't have those categories. There isn't really a well-established mixed race culture, let's say. And that mixed race group consists of mainly people who are part Afro-Caribbean and part white, but there are some people who are mixed white Asian, for example, and various other mixes, generally with white British people. So there isn't that sort of unitary myth and memory and collective memory and culture that's attached to this. Plus, it's a small group.
Okay, so I think one thing there that I think was interesting was you said about there is no mixed race culture, and obviously we can see that, obviously probably due to the size, but also, as you say, due to the lack of history and myth. As the mixed race population grows, do you not think that there will be like almost a fracturing of that mixed race population into, say, Afro white and, say, Indian white and even like further mixes? Like, is that going to be the next frontier of kind of intergroup tensions?
Well, I think that what you will get is say multiple melting pots. Like in the US, I think you've got an African American melting pot, you have an American Indian melting pot, and a white melting pot. And other groups are more or less melting into those because those are the established, those are groups that have a longer history and perhaps more cultural capital in some way due to their long-term association with the territory. I mean, I think if you were to say this country, will you get a very distinctive mixed race group like the Cape Coloureds of South Africa or the Métis in Canada? I don't think you necessarily will, because in those situations, you had a very distinct mixture that was incubated over a long period of time, and they developed distinctive symbols. And I think what I see in many Western countries like Britain is simply super diversity and a lot of mixing. But essentially the major groups and the traditions of the major groups are pretty established. I guess I would expect that a lot of the mixed would in some ways become allocated into established groups. They just might be on a fuzzy boundary. They might have ethnic options to choose one group or the other, but I still think because the established traditions are all more or less from the main groups, I have a hard time seeing the emergence of a very distinctive mestizo type group that has distinctive symbols. I just don't know if I see that emerging.
Okay, thank you. I think at the moment there definitely seems to be an issue to talk about, immigration in this country, but also as you mentioned, there is obviously a difficulty in addressing demographic change in general, partly because it is seen as racist to even talk about it. So what are the key difficulties in talking about and addressing demographic change?
Well, one of the biggest problems I think
what are the key difficulties in talking about and addressing? Sorry, I've got no idea what was going on there. Sorry.
Right. Okay. No. One of the difficulties we have is this definition of racism is extremely expansive and elastic. Especially progressives will try and push the boundaries of the meaning of racism to include many things, including not wanting the ethnic composition of a country to change too rapidly. Instead of sort of seeing this as shades of gray, some people wanting things slower, some wanting them faster. Because of this almost religious reverence for this concept of racism, you wind up in a situation where it's a binary, totalizing binary of you're either open or you're closed. And if you want it slower, you're closed and you're a bigot. And so we can never get past that to the more subtle, nuanced conversation that says, no, people have attachments. Ethnic composition is part of what gives, particularity to a nation, the historic. Now that's a mixture, right? So it is not to say that everybody is white or, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a slowly changing ethnic composition with melting going on so that you have a certain number of people who are melting into established groups. And so that process is going on. It's very difficult the other problem that if you have this very binary take, there's a view that says people who want it slower, that's because they're scared of and they hate or they feel superior to various different groups that are entering the country. Whereas in the psychology literature, we know that actually attachment to and hatred of or dislike of are separate dispositions. And for example, if you look at the American National Election Study, there's a question about how warm do you feel to Black people, how warm do you feel towards Hispanic people and towards white people. If a white person feels very warm towards white people, they do not feel less warm towards Black and Hispanic people than a white person who doesn't feel particularly warm towards white people. In other words, it's a bit like saying, if I feel really attached to my family, that doesn't make me hate the neighbors more. Actually, now, of course, if I feel really attached to being a Republican, then I do hate the Democrats more and vice versa. So in some relationships, they're zero sum and some are not. The ethnic and racial one is not in peacetime. In wartime it is, but not in peacetime. And yet there's this persistent attempt to force these things together so that if you are, say, attached to a particular group or it's a particular composition of the nation and don't want that to change too rapidly because that's the nation and whatever, that's what you're effectively attached to, then you are a racist because you must hate somebody. It's not. It's actually largely about you can be perfectly comfortable with newcomers and with difference and whatever, but you just may be attached to a particular historic ethnic composition, yes, changing, but you want it to change at a slower rate, perhaps, or you want time so that intermarriage and assimilation can take place to limit the degree of change. And I think that's all perfectly legitimate, that we should be able to have an agreed accommodation between the ones who want this change to be fast, the ones who want it slow, but instead what we have is this strange shadow conversation where, you can only talk about economics, it's going to cost jobs, or it's not going to cost jobs, or essentially otherwise you're a bigot. So I just think it's a very sort of truncated and narrow conversation. It doesn't really get at the actual motivations, which a lot of the academic research will show. I mean, the actual motivations for wanting to reduce immigration or increase immigration have very little to do, essentially nothing to do with personal economic circumstances.
And how far do you think current governments are addressing demographic change, if at all? And well, yeah, I mean, yeah, like how far do you think they actually are?
Well, I think they are, in the sense that, well, they're aware of it because they know it's driving opinion on the immigration issue. So, for example, the Tories, when they talked about reducing migration to the tens of thousands, and even something like the Brexit vote, a lot of, immigration was the number one issue for 40% of Leave voters. And without that issue, there's no way you'd have a Brexit. So that issue is very intimately tied up with Brexit. And even though people said, oh, it's all about East European migration, that was actually only part of the motivation. So part of the motivation was that there was an equal amount of non-European and European migration, and the levels were historically high from the late 1990s onward. And so you had a lot of people who wanted those numbers reduced. It was something like 3/4 wanted those numbers reduced. And so governments have been aware of this, and the Tories did try and reduce it somewhat. They weren't able to really do it. So they said, once we have Brexit, they sort of insinuated that once we have control, take back control, then we'll be able to regulate the numbers. I think the reality is, even under Brexit, they have not actually done that. And I suspect I don't know when this is going to happen, but if the current numbers continue, I suspect there's going to be a split on the right, and you're going to see the emergence of some kind of a populist force there. But of course, if the Conservatives are then able to get hold of this issue and respond, then that won't emerge. But if they aren't able to do that, as we saw under the Cameron government, when Cameron wasn't able to do it, UKIP moved in. And this is kind of the trend we see on the European continent as well, with a big increase in migration from 2014 through the migrant crisis. You see immigration shoot up people's list of priorities. And right along with that, in 9 out of 10 West European countries, the support for the populist right really rises a lot. Just to give you an idea, I mean, if you take, for example, the Sweden Democrats, a Swedish study was done, I think it was 99% of Swedish Democrat voters wanted immigration reduced. The connection between immigration attitudes and particularly the priority people give to the immigration issue and voting for populist right parties is by far and away the strongest connection. That's mainly why we're seeing the populist right in Western Europe.
I think that's disconcerting in many ways, because it feels like you're caught between a rock and a hard place. In many ways, you either address the populist right concern and actually do something, or you carry on as you are and risk upsetting the more moderate voters. Do you think that's like a compromise that can't be reached?
Oh no, I think it can be reached. I mean, if you take this country, for example, I mean, wanting the average amount of migration that, if you take the average median voter, they want about 100,000 a year. If migration's up around 300, it's not controversial to want to reduce it to, say, a 100. They don't want zero. No one's looking for an ethno-state. They're wanting a slower pace of change. And, the populist right is simply representing the strongest element of people who want it very, very low. But I mean, a government that came in that tried to kind of come in the middle between, very strong restrictionists and people who just want somewhat less, and said, okay, we'll aim for 100,000 or whatever it is. I think they could command a majority. So I don't think, ultimately, I don't think governments can, for in an indeterminate amount of time, simply ignore this issue, because it is a difficult issue. And again, we're not going to have zero immigration, but people who want it slower, which is a majority, and for some people that's a very important issue. I think it's legitimate in the democratic process to take account of that. And I think the problem is when you get taboos which say, if you take account of that, you're a racist, so we're not going to take account of it, then all you're doing is, it's a bit like the old Soviet Union, you know, where you're only selling one brand of pants, and therefore the black market's going to pop up and sell the blue jeans and everything. And so if the main parties say we're not going to touch the issue, that's what creates the black market opportunity for an AFD or a UKIP or a Sweden Democrats to move in and say, well, we're going to speak what others are afraid to speak, right? So in a way, the taboos are what create the market opportunity. Not to say that every taboo is wrong, right? So I think there was a taboo on returning to segregation in the US. George Wallace came in as a third-party candidate that was pushing segregation. The main parties were right to say, no, we're not going there. And that eventually went away. But in this case, it's a very different issue. It's not an issue of civil rights within a country. It's about how a country relates to the rest of the world in terms of the numbers it takes in. It's perfectly within its rights to govern the rate of immigration. So I think that's a sort of the attempt to transpose the racism civil rights issue onto immigration is, in my view, wrongheaded, and simply is not actually a legitimate way of conducting a democratic discussion. This has to be an issue that is up for discussion, where both sides reach an accommodation. That's the healthy way to proceed. If you start throwing taboos everywhere to try and narrow the Overton window of acceptable debate, I think you're just creating a market for populism.
So what, obviously, like you say, the Conservative Party have tried to reduce immigration. What more can be done in the short to medium term?
Well, I mean, COVID's obviously reduced the numbers considerably. So COVID actually dampens down a lot of these issues. And also, the other thing is that when people are worried about COVID and the economy, they're less worried about immigration, because COVID and the economy are occupying the room. The oxygen is being sucked up by those issues. The thing is that as those issues, if those issues are resolved and they start to fade, then the immigration issue is going to rise. Now, of course, we have Brexit, where I think a lot of voters have been sort of thinking, well, let's make Brexit a success. Once we have Brexit, we'll get control back, and then we can determine the numbers that we allow in. And the government's talked about points and it's talked about control, and that's all fine. But I think if the numbers remain high, this issue is not going to remain off the agenda. So I think, I mean, the Conservatives have shown themselves to be adaptable. So I would suspect if that starts to rise up the agenda and they start to feel the heat on that, they will probably try and respond. I don't see a reason necessary. I mean, unless that causes a split between the sort of more global Britain types and the sort of populist voting base of the Conservatives. I mean, that's a possibility. We haven't seen that split yet emerge out into the open. It could emerge. I'm not sure it will emerge, but it could emerge.
Okay. And I think we've talked a lot about, the right, and fair to do so, because obviously, like you say, it's electorally tied to this topic. But there's been a few studies and a few books that point out that the Labour Party in Britain at the beginning of the 21st century intentionally tried, in their own words, to rub the right's nose in diversity. Now, can the value divide between left and right over immigration really be bridged?
Well, yeah, I mean, I know the quote you're mentioning, and that is a real thing, but I'm not sure that the Labour government ever thought in such strategic terms. I think they were more just reacting in the moment. They wanted to be humanitarian, but they weren't really thinking, yeah, we're going to change the composition of it. I don't think there was anything like that kind of strategic decision making. But what I would say is, this is increasingly becoming the symbolic issue that divides, particularly the metropolitan, what Rob Ford would call the identity liberals, or David Goodhart would call the anywhere section of the Labour vote, from the 50% or more of the country that wants controls. And particularly that group of well-educated, often metropolitan progressives who are motivated by that cultural cosmopolitanism, who see your views on immigration as a kind of litmus test on whether you are a racist or not, which is a kind of litmus test of how moral and individual you are. And there is a sort of sacralization of race along with gender and sexuality, such that anything that can be construed as being in some way offensive to members of a minority group, even if that group actually isn't offended, but if you can imagine that the most sensitive member of that group would be offended. So that is where the morality, and there's a real moral fervor here. Something Matthew Iglesias, the American writer, calls the Great Awakening. This is sort of an ideological ferment around what I call left modernism, which is the dominant elite ideology of our age in elite institutions like universities, which is a kind of cultural leftism. And that is what's captivated, that sort of avant-garde cultural leftism has really captivated the minds of a lot of identity liberals. And so that is so important to them and what they're about. To actually compromise on immigration would be a negation of everything they're about. And that's one of the reasons it's so difficult for that group to ever compromise. This is like a sacred value, and there's no way they can compromise on that. And of course, immigration is also a very important value to people who want to slow down the pace of ethnic change in Britain, who want the nation they grew up with not to change too much. And so, yeah, it sort of sets up a dynamic for polarization. Now, it's not as extreme here as it is in the US and increasingly in Canada, where I'm from, by the way. You can see it in the survey data. This huge immigration is sort of the views on immigration, which were only about 10 points apart between, say, Republicans and Democrats, or in Canada, the Liberals and the Conservatives. I mean, that's like 50 points now. You know, in Britain, it's 40 points. Not 50, it's not 55, but it's 40. So it's moving in the direction, mainly because the identity liberals are shaping the views of labor. So the average labor voter was like 70% wanting reduction of immigration in 2010. And that's now sort of maybe around 50. So that's been a big liberalization. And I predict that's going to become even more liberal amongst your labor voters going forward. Similar to what we see in the US, where, by the way, something like 60% of white liberal Americans want more immigration. And something we've never seen, by the way, in the survey data, historic. So it's a real powerful identity movement.
And do you think that that's going to damage their electoral chances?
Yeah, I think if that faction gets control of the party, it will make the party unelectable. I mean, we know that Labour had its worst results since 1935. We know that across continental Europe, the mainstream left has been registering some of the worst results that it has ever registered since the war. Yeah, this is a big crisis on the left, that as the left parties that do bend towards that identity liberal segment, that go that route, are doing badly. Now, in the US, there's a much larger ethnic minority population that still leans towards the Democrats. And so you can conceivably take your white identity liberals and add the ethnic minority vote and make a go of it like Biden does. Although, if he doesn't get control of the border, I think at the midterms he's going to lose quite a bit, but it doesn't matter. It is at least it's a possibility in the US in a way I don't think it's possible in Britain or in other West European countries, to have a coalition between identity liberals and ethnic minorities that's big enough to win. I just don't think it's possible.
Okay, well, thank you. That's most of the questions that we have from the Mallard team. So thank you for that. We now kind of want to open this up to the Q&A and see if anyone has any questions. So anyone in the audience, if you'd like to ask a question, please enter it in the Q&A and we'll read it out. And I'm sure Professor Kaufmann will be happy to answer those. If anyone doesn't have any questions in the meantime, then I'm sure I can rustle up a couple. So yeah, brilliant. So we've got one from Adam Lim, who said that Professor Kaufmann mentioned the recent survey asking how warm people felt towards individuals of other races, and that whites' warmness towards themselves was not correlated towards warmness towards others. So what are your thoughts on the finding that blacks were very warm towards themselves and very cold towards whites. And what are the implications for this as demographic trends? What are the implications if this as a demographic trend in America continues?
Well, I don't think that the average African American, I mean, I'd have to cast my mind back. I don't think they're especially cold towards whites, actually. They're warmer towards themselves than they are towards whites, which is normal for most groups. I don't actually think they are super cold towards whites. I mean, I think that they are more likely to say they've experienced racism and to say that that's why African Americans can't get ahead and so on. So I think you have that, and I think they have a very, well, along with white liberals, they have a very skewed perception of the police, for example. So roughly, I did a study recently that showed that about 8 in 10 African American Biden voters, and most African Americans voted for the Democrats. So about 8 in 10 African American Biden voters thought that a young black man was more likely to be shot by the police than to die in a traffic accident, even though the actual numbers are about 10 to 1 more likely to die in a car accident than to be shot by the police. And so that perception, that misperception, if you like, of the level of danger presented by the police, particularly for unarmed, but even for armed, but particularly for unarmed young black men. It was something like around 20 that were killed last year. It's sort of about like getting struck by lightning, and yet there is this belief that it's just very dangerous to be young and black and male, and it's not. So there is this perception, but I don't think that translates into a feeling of coldness towards white people. I mean, actually, that's, I think, very overstated. And we see a lot of, a big increase in interracial marriage, black and white. We see generally the attitudes on interracial marriage, and there's more mixing, and African Americans are moving out of some of the traditional concentration areas. And so, yeah, I don't actually think the relation between the races are actually, I think those are getting better, and they're actually pretty good. But in terms of perceptions of the police, that's, I think, a different matter.
Thank you. We have one from Mark Correa, who says, hi, Professor Kaufmann. Is there a historical precedent for this kind of demographic shift, or is it an entirely new and modern phenomenon?
Well, God, that's a good question. I mean, yes, I'd say there is a precedent in the sense of the large scale. If you take the US, for example, the US was about roughly, at the time of independence, if you took the free population, it was about 80% British ancestry and 98% Protestant in 1790, let's say. And starting in about the 1840s, you saw a lot of Irish Catholics coming and German Catholics. And so by the time you get into the 1920s, the sort of Anglo-Protestant share had dropped around 50, dropped to below 50 or around 50. And that's also, by the way, a time when you had large-scale Protestant populism, immigration restrictionism, and the politics of immigration became key for the United States, as it is increasingly becoming so today. So yeah, we've seen that, we have seen that process of ethnic shifting being rapid in the past in say the US. And then there was a period from 1924 to 1965 when there were new immigration laws put in that pretty much attempted to freeze the ethnic composition of the US. Since 1965, there's been an opening up, and then you've seen an increase since then in the foreign-born share. So yeah, we have got a precedent for this. What I would say is the assimilation process for the Catholic and Jewish immigrants took around 70 to 80 years, took like 3-4 generations. And so I don't think we should kid ourselves about how long it takes for a group to become kind of melted into the ethnic majority. It does take 3-4 generations. Now, of course, not everybody's going to melt in completely. That's fine, but you need a certain, I think you would, arguably, you would need a certain percentage to melt in order for some of the tensions around this issue to sort of calm down a little bit. So I think there is historical precedent. Now, of course, there are also places where it didn't resolve itself very well, like Ivory Coast, and I don't want to go into the violent cases, because there are many differences between a place like Ivory Coast, which became majority, arguably majority Muslim or majority Northern, through decades and decades and decades of migration from the north into the Christian south. But there's so many differences between a country like that and say a country like Britain or the US. I wouldn't want to draw the comparison too closely.
Thank you. We have Andrew Trobolewski, who says or asks, do you think the forecasted demographic shift is inevitable?
I think a lot of it is built in just because of a younger age structure amongst minority populations. Well, some of it is built in. It's not. But I also think that what's more likely to happen is through mixing and assimilation and melting, that the ethnic majority might reconstitute itself as a sort of, essentially still the same ethnic majority, but with different strains mixed in, sort of Beijing, as the term Michael Lind uses. That's sort of what I think is more likely to happen long term. But between now and then, we are going to have higher diversity. And, now it is obviously, is it inevitable? I think it's largely inevitable. Yes, I think it's very difficult to see. But when I say inevitable, I mean, if you're thinking long term, that ethnic majority could easily become, again, 95% of the population through assimilation. So but in the medium term, up to 2050, I think, we are going to become more diverse in all countries across the West.
Thank you. I think that relates to another question that it's two questions. So if you don't mind, I'll read them out. But I think it relates to this. So this is from an anonymous attendee who says that nearly half of Black American men and a third of Black Caribbean women are in inter-ethnic relationships in the UK. And most of the adult children of these relationships are either dating or married to white British people, which I can assume is inevitable given that white people are the majority in the country. So from this person has two questions. First of all, in your opinion, are the offspring of these mixed race couples of white and mostly Black more likely to identify as white than Black? And second, and relating to pretty much what you just said, if the trend continues and immigration from the West Indies remains low, do you think the Black Caribbean population will essentially disappear through assimilation?
Well, we know that in fact it's already declined a lot. So a lot of people, the children will be in the mixed race category on the census, and the parents, and will identify that sort of that way, and the parents one might be white and one's Afro-Caribbean. So there's already been a sort of decline in a way in the Afro-Caribbean community due to outmarriage. How people identify, that's interesting. So if you take Asian white mix, that the offspring tend to identify, they're more likely to identify as white than say a Black white mix, where there is, I think, more of a tendency to go towards the mixed race category. An extreme example, the Hispanic white mix in the US, the third generation, I think is 60% now identifying as white. So the East Asian white and the Hispanic white mixes tend to have a slight preponderance towards identifying as white. Part of this just depends also on the relative size of groups. I mean, if sort of unmixed whites, if you like, are 80% or 90% of the population, then if you are of mixed background, what's going to be distinctive about you, you're going to be more like the minorities than the white majority. But once you reach a certain critical mass where you've got a very large number of, if the mixed race population is 30% and the unmixed whites are 40%, and it starts to get, the context starts to shift. And of course the global context also, where whites as a sort of share of the global population might be 10% now, they were 30% maybe in 1950, are going to be in single digits. So there will be, I think, my sense of this is that there might be more of a, not pressure, but I think what will make sense to people might be more likely to identify with the majority tradition rather than with minority traditions. And maybe what will regulate the way someone identifies which ethnic option they choose is one, which group will accept them most easily, number one, and whether there are any racial barriers. But also number two, ideology is important. So in the US, for example, people who are part Hispanic and part white, if they are a Republican, they're more likely to identify as white. If they are Democrat, they're more likely to identify as Latino. And I'd expect something like that also to be occurring in this country, where people who are maybe on the left might be more likely to identify with their multicultural background, and those who are on the right may be less likely to. So that, I think that's sort of how I might see it playing out, say, in the medium term. But in the very long term, I think it'll be like Mexico, or like, you know, a country where more or less you have a melting pot and there people more or less gravitate to the dominant tradition.
Thank you. And on the topic of ideology, we have a question from Mario Lagos, who says, "Hi, Eric. At present, the British Labour Party is unwilling to materially shift towards more restrictive immigration measures. Do you think that a fifth consecutive election defeat, which would be the next election if they lost, do you think that could see them moving towards something approximating the Norway model, or is this a bridge too far given the demography and ideology of the British Labour Party?"
Yeah, I think that the thing is, the problem in a way is that that left modernism, this new hegemonic ideology, which is a fusion of liberal identity categories and concerns with a socialist victim oppressor framework fused together, that is animating the identity left as it is in the US. The difference is, in the US, it is a possibly viable strategy for some elections. In a way, it's not a viable strategy here. And I think that, however, because the activists, and not just the Corbynites, but I mean, throughout the Labour Party, this is such an important belief system amongst the activists that, in a way, it's part of the reason why they're in the Labour Party. I think it would be just very, very difficult for Labour to go there now, even though Starmer knows, and he would probably in his heart of hearts like to get Labour moving in that direction. But I just think he faces a real uphill battle when a lot of the true believers, they don't want to go towards a Denmark-Norway scenario. So I think it might take a number of election defeats before that occurs. Although, you know, I say election defeats, but it is also possible that if the Conservative Party, you know, has a split, that could offer Labour an opportunity as well. So nothing's foreordained in election history. But right now, I don't see Labour moving towards the Denmark-Norway model, no.
Thank you. Looking across to Northern Ireland, Chris Winter has asked, what is the opinion of the people of Northern Ireland towards immigration, especially in terms of Republic of Ireland immigration to Northern Ireland and European immigration to Northern Ireland?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, Northern Ireland doesn't get a huge amount of immigration, and you know, and that's not, in some ways, it's not exactly the most economically vibrant part of the UK. There is some East European immigration, has been, which has tended to be Catholic, but in a way, those Catholic immigrants don't seem to have identified so strongly with nationalism, and therefore, I think, aren't seen as a huge threat by the Unionists. And so I think, you know, my sense is there's not going to be enormous immigration there, and the immigration that has gone there has not really stoked up the tensions amongst the Unionists. So I mean, in general, I'm not as pessimistic on Northern Ireland as many others are. I think the cause of things there is very much domestic. You have to understand the domestic traditions and things like Brexit. There may be things, it may excite a protest on the edges. I don't think it is. They're not going back to war. I just don't believe anything like that. I don't believe the Good Friday Agreement is in jeopardy just because there's some sort of a nominal East-West customs check or something like that. I don't think that's, it's a slight symbolic issue, but it's not going to cause anything major, I don't think.
Thank you. We have a question from Dustin Lovell, who's in California, who asks, many 19th century writers often use race when they describe more of what we'd consider culture, with the two words becoming separated through the 20th century, both via globalization and the rejection of racialism. What would you say the word race means now as it is used, and how does that relate to culture?
Well, race, it means a group that's denoted by some physical trait. Now, of course, race is, physically, race is a bit like color on a rainbow. Actually, there are no actual colors. It's a continuum, but our brains process the colors, and cultural conventions most cultures have a word for green and blue. Some don't, by the way, but almost all do. And so, yeah, I think race is a bit like that, where, there are no races, there's kind of continuum, but it is about essentially the way physical traits are used to taxonomize populations, either in a folk way or in a scientific way. And that is different from ethnicity, which is about a subjective belief in common ancestry, which uses different markers like religion, language, and sometimes skin color to denote the boundary. But what's important is so you have to look at these two different levels of ethnicity and race. They're not the same thing. So, for example, I'm trying to think of how best to explain this. What happens is that ethnic groups might use physical markers to denote, an African American and a white American in the US South. They're more or less Protestant, they're more or less English speaking similarly. The distinction is on physical traits and color. Now, that distinction can be a blurry, you can have a blurry boundary, or you can have a very hard boundary, which certainly existed in the US South, arguably exists still. But in other cases, these boundaries are much blurrier, and people can move across the boundaries. And I think that's where we're moving. So I hope I've kind of answered your question. I mean, culture per se is not, I don't think it's integral to the definition of race. Culture is sort of the external practices and visible practices of a community, whereas race is much more about physical traits, even though, of course, the boundaries between races and where you draw those boundaries, is a North African white, is a Hispanic person white, these sorts of in-between groups exist, and there's fuzziness at those boundaries, but I don't think anyone would say that a blonde-haired, blue-eyed person could be anything other than white, and likewise, with other, so there are people in the middle who are hard to categorize and who can move around, and then you've got people who are relatively easy to categorize. But what's more important in a way are the ethnic groups in terms of historical forces, these communities that believe themselves to be descended from the same ancestors. The Jews descended from Abraham and the 12 tribes. Somebody might be Black, but they can be part of it because they've got that same myth of ancestry, regardless of whether it's true or not genetically. But so the ethnicity is more the subjective belief in common descent, but that group can use markers like physical differences to differentiate itself from other groups.
Thank you. I think that's another part of Dustin's question, which I was going to follow on, was about ethnicity. So thank you. That was really interesting to hear. I have a question from William Yarwood, who asks, you mentioned African Americans and other ethnic minorities tend to vote Democrat. If one believes that these ethnic minority groups will grow over the next few decades, do you think the Republicans will change in order to accommodate this, or will the Republican Party just never win an election again?
Well, it's very complicated. Imagine two things are going on. One is the country's getting less white and more diverse on the one hand, and so that's moving against the Republicans. But then you have another trend, which is the non-whites are moving towards the Republican Party over time at a certain rate. So you have the country becoming more diverse at a certain rate, and you have the minorities becoming less Democrat at a certain rate. The question is, which of those two rates is faster? And that is really essentially the bottom line. So, just to give you an idea of the, so the electorate has become, I think in this last election, it was something like only about 66% white, I think, in the US. I could have that a little bit low. Maybe it's a little higher than that in terms of the electorate. Maybe it was closer to 70. But the minority vote has moved in the last three elections
shifted a little bit towards the Republicans each election. And if you look at party identification, in 2008, it was about 75% of Hispanics, Asians, and Blacks were Democrats, according to the American National Election Study. In 2019, it was only 51%. So that's a huge decline in attachment. There's a whole bunch of reasons why that's happening. Third generation Hispanic Americans are much more Republican than first generation. They're much less likely to have relatives that are subject to potential deportation. African Americans are, because they're moving out of the traditional areas and they're no longer under the, I won't say control, but the influence of their churches and communities, then if they're natural Republicans, let's say, for whatever reason, maybe they favor low tax, maybe they are worried about illegal immigration. If they were in their African-American milieu, then there would be a lot of social pressure on them to vote Democrat and to be Democrats. As they move out of that social pressure weakens a little bit. And so that's one of the reasons that a number of authors have pointed to why the African-American vote is becoming less Democrat. It's going to be interesting to see what happens next election, whether that trend continues.
Thank you. There's a question from Jake Painter, which I think is quite interesting because we haven't really touched on this much. Do you think that the demographic shifts in the USA, Britain, and the wider West will change those societies' foreign policies, if at all?
Good question. I mean, there's so much going on with foreign policy. You know, there's China and there's Russia and there is, but you know, one of the axes that is emerging because of the rise of left modernism, this wokeness, which is reconfiguring the nature of the left in a lot of, and because that's quite a powerful group within the media, within elite institutions like universities. One of the things we're seeing is a sort of growing fracturing and polarization between, if you know, on this quote unquote open closed dimension between the so-called anywhere somewhere divide. And that cultural cleavage is, I think, got a foreign policy dimension in this, insofar as, you know, not just Orban and Poland and Hungary, but also Russia. There is a kind of an axis connecting Russia, Eastern Europe, to the populist right parties, to Trumpism in a loose way, in the sense of defending, if you like, a more ethnocultural notion of nationalism against a sort of more quote unquote globalist kind of, you know, multicultural version of society and vision. And to the extent that is the emerging cleavage within, not only within countries, but also if it's a cleavage that results in alliances between countries, which it is increasingly doing, at least intellectually, that could have foreign policy consequences. You know, so depending on who gets elected, whether they're more pro-multicultural or more sort of populist nationalist, that could affect which alliances they tend to forge. So that's one way in which these demographic shifts could lead to a kind of axis of nationalists versus, or axis of populist nationalists versus an axis of kind of multicultural globalists. I mean, to put these things very crudely. So yeah, there are some foreign policy implications, but I think foreign policy has got so many factors affecting it. I would hesitate to make any bets.
Thank you. And building on that, Jake's asked a second question, which I think is coincidentally about Hungary. So he said that, you know, you mentioned that race and culture aren't too intimately connected. There's a connection, but they're not too intimately connected. But if you look at a country like Hungary, they derive a huge amount of identity from the fact that their ancestors descended from the Asian steppe, which is quite distinct from the wider Slavic community in Eastern and Central Europe, and obviously Russia as well. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, I mean, ethnicity plays a big role in the national identity of a lot of countries, and not just the Eastern European countries. I think there's this tendency to think that countries either have an ethnic kind of national identity like Hungary, or they have a civic kind of national identity, maybe like the US or France. The reality is if you look at public opinion in these countries, there's an ethnic and a civic national identity competing in some way. I mean, I don't like using the term ethnic and civic. It's much more complicated than that. But crudely put, there are different versions of national identity competing in Western countries and to some extent even in Eastern countries. It's just that who has the upper hand is slightly different in each scenario. So the mix of the two is slightly more, you know, it may favor the ethnic more in Hungary and it may favor the civic more in America, perhaps. But I think what we're looking at is contested and competing ethnic and civic national identities within each country. That's what we're looking at. So it's too crude to say one country is ethnic and one civic. And so just to sort of illustrate, I mean, I think in a country like the US or Britain, progressives will tend to identify with diversity and multi-ethnicity as their ethnic myth, if you like. So they also have an ethnic myth that they think contributes to the distinctiveness of their country, whereas conservatives will tend to have a more view of a more traditional ethnic composition, not ethnically homogenous ethnostates. I think that's only an extremist. I mean, it's maybe larger in a place like Hungary, but generally people who might say be in favor of slower ethnic change, wanting to see more assimilation before more immigration or higher rates of immigration are permitted and so on. And in that sense, you just have a different view of how ethnic composition contributes to national particularity. One side identifies with diversity, another identifies with a sort of historic ethnic composition.
Thank you. And I think, if I may, I'd like to kind of ask my own question to kind of finish off here. I think that the complication of civic versus ethnic nationalism is a particularly important point. I mean, I'm thinking especially of Bernard Yack's book on the moral psychology of community, which addresses this complication. But one thing that I've always kind of had in the back of my mind when talking about nationalism is that the Latin word gens is the root word for people, race, and nation in different ways, but that is the root word. So my thesis, and I'd like to hear what you think on this, race isn't going anywhere, but the conversation on race will change. Hence, part of my question about, you know, into like mixed race, different forms of mixed race identities. What are your thoughts? Are we going to always be talking about race?
Well, I don't know. I think less so. I mean, I think you will eventually, I mean, this is looking ahead. You know, we already have some transracial ethnic groups. If you just think about the Hawaiians or the Native Americans, you know, they're so intermarried with other groups, they all identify through their ancestry. They still have an archetype, which is based on a Polynesian looking person, even though they may be many different colors. Or if you look at the Pashtuns of Afghanistan or the Turkmen of Central Asia, some look more Oriental, to use that old word, some look more Caucasian, to use that old word, but that doesn't seem to be an important differentiator within this group, because everyone knows that luck of the draw, a kid could wind up looking more this or that from the same parents. And so I think it might become something like surnames, you know, between, if you look at the South Tyroleans, this is the sort of southern part of, well, this is the northern part of Italy. You have a German-speaking population there. And some of them have an Italian surname, and some of the Italians have a German surname because there's been intermarriage. It's a bit like the Irish. Jerry Adams, you know, that's an English surname, and Terence O'Neill, he's a unionist, but he's got an Irish surname. Because of these historic intermarriages, you get a certain amount of mixing, so that no longer can you say, aha, someone has this surname that's Italian, they must be Italian. Well, that's no longer an accurate guide anymore for what their beliefs are about their ancestry. And I think we're probably going to get to that point where someone's physical appearance may not be an accurate guide to the way they think about themselves, and therefore you can't attribute identity to them on the basis of visible appearance. That's probably where we're heading. But again, that's next century more, or late this century rather than our lifetimes. Certainly not my lifetime.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, thank you very much for such a fantastic discussion, Professor Kaufmann. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for all of your fantastic questions, for everyone who's come along. I hope you've had a good evening, Professor Kaufmann. It's been
I have. Great questions, and keep up the good work, Jake.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'll end the call here, and I'll speak to you very shortly. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.